Thank you all for coming. An hour ago it was pouring rain, and I wondered if anyone would make it out of their house. So we're glad you're here. I'm Matthew Goulet. I'm the Executive Director here at Salem Art Association. Thanks for accommodating this space. It's obviously a little bit odd to have a wall in the middle, but it is such an extraordinary exhibition, so fitting to this talk. 11 Oregon-based Black artists, obviously working across different medium. There's some audio, visual performance art here. There's textile art. This incredible mural by Bend-based artist Mosley Wada, who is here. Well, you want to stand up? No? Mosley is going to come back. There's a smaller wall behind this one as you enter the annex. And Mo's going to come back every 6 months and paint a new mural, which is both permanent, because it's a part of the building forever, and temporary, because every 6 months he will paint it over and create a new one. And so we're looking at some dates in June for the first one. We'll let you all know. Also, there's so many people. I want to thank our staff. We have board members here. We have members. We have volunteers. Thank you all. We can't do this programming without you. And a special guest is the founder of Oregon Black Pioneers, Willie Richardson. Willie, do you want to stand in? Willie, you founded Oregon Black Pioneers 27 years ago?
A long time.
Is that right? 29, somebody said. Exactly. All right. Well, thank you for that. You know, as all of you know, Salem Art Association also runs the Bush House Museum, right across the street, of course. It's a beautiful house built in the 1870s, a gorgeous piece of architecture. Inside, if you haven't been in, we've been closed because of the pandemic, but if you haven't been inside, you know, it's preserved largely as a period house. The wallpapering, the objects, the furniture, and it's a really beautiful specimen. It's a physical structure, you know, of the house in the 1870s. That was the grandest house in Salem. But of course, there's more to a house than the objects and the architecture. There's a history to every house. That's a house that sits on Kalapuya land, just as all of us today, right now, are sitting on Kalapuya land, and there's a history there. It's a house that sits on the top of a hill, which meant something, maybe certainly now, but definitely in the 1870s. It's a house that sits on 100 acres, which back then was privately owned and is now Bush Pasture Park. There's a history to a house that sits on a hill and has 100 acres. And it's a house, of course, built by a man who was both very successful in journalism and finance banking, and also very deeply flawed. A strong advocate for the worst exclusionary laws, the worst part of our history, the exclusionary laws. I'm going to stop talking about Bush because we have in the house somebody who knows the history much better, and I don't certainly want to say anything that I won't quite get right, which is why we have an expert. But I do want to frame this notion of a house for a minute. Many of you know Isabel Wilkerson, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and writer. She wrote Cash most recently. And she uses the metaphor of a house to describe the history of race and race relations, racism in this country. And I thought it'd be useful to read an excerpt. America is an old house. When you live in an old house, you may not want to go into the basement after a storm to see what the rains have brought. Choose not to look, however, at your own peril. The owner of an old house knows that whatever you are ignoring will never go away. Whatever is lurking will fester whether you choose to look or not. Whatever you are wishing away will gnaw at you until you have the courage to face what you would rather not see. She continues, many people may rightly say, I had nothing to do with how all this started. I have nothing to do with the sins of the past. My ancestors never attacked indigenous people. My ancestors never owned slaves. She says, yes, it's true. Not one of us was here when that house was built. And yet here we are, the current occupants of a property with stress cracks, bowed walls, and fissures built into the foundation. We are the heirs to whatever is right or wrong with this house. We did not erect the uneven pillars or joists, but they are ours to deal with now. It is ours to deal with now. And I say that partly because it is our responsibility at Salem Art Association as shepherds of the Bush House Museum to deal with it now. But more broadly, it is all of our responsibility. It's a public-owned building. It's city taxpayer money that pays for the roof, literal roof, to get fixed. And so we all have a responsibility and, I think, an opportunity. It's what this lecture is really kicking off today, what we're calling the Bush House Reimagining Project. It's a process, it's a conversation. We believe in the power of art to heal, to tell stories, to reveal, to have a community conversation. And we intend to use art and different perspectives from different artists to follow that process through. And when I say art, I mean art broadly, certainly visual art, but also writing, lectures, music, culinary arts, fashion arts. All of these have a place in reinterpreting, reimagining the history of that house and the history of Salem, the history of Oregon. What we're doing here is both unique to Salem, I think. Bush was an influential person in Salem, but it also part and parcel of this broader conversation that the country is having right now about race and racism. So without further ado, I want to introduce Zachary. We just had a delightful lunch together. It lasted only an hour. I'd still be talking to him until 4 p.m. if he didn't have to get here. He is a public historian, a museum professional, and of course now the executive director of Oregon Black Pioneers. He previously interned or worked at Colonial Williamsburg in Virginia, where I think he got his start in history. The Smithsonian Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., and the Northwest African American Museum in Seattle. He is also currently, and I believe he loves this part of his work, a seasonal park ranger at Lewis and Clark National Historical Park in Astoria. One of the best experiences I ever had was taking my children there and meeting interpretive rangers like Zachary. He holds a BA in History from the College of William and Mary, a certificate in Public History from the National Institute for American History and Democracy, and an MA in Museology from the University of Washington. It's a great honor for us to have him. Please welcome Zachary.
Well, thank you, everyone. That was a really nice introduction. It's wonderful to be with you here, especially in person. I've been at Oregon Black Pioneers now for just under 2 years, and I think this is only the third in-person presentation I've given, so this is very exciting. We do a lot of presentations, and I would say the vast majority of the talks that I give are related to more general histories of people of African descent in Oregon. So this is a really special presentation because it's one that I was able to develop specifically for this talk today, and so this is the first of its kind. And I'll just acknowledge one other thing, and that is that Matthew says there's someone he would turn to who knows much more about this than he does. And I'll say, maybe that's true, but only by a little. I am a historian, but I'm a public historian, and that means that my job is to tell stories. I take existing academic research, gather as much as I can, and try to present dense academic writing into something that feels engaging and illuminating for the general public. And so this is a story that I've put together based on just an interesting link that I noticed in some of the materials that we've compiled. A link between Asahel Bush of the Oregon Statesman and Hiram Gorman, who once worked for that paper, and the paper which bridged the two of them within a relatively short amount of time. And trying to figure out what we can learn about Black experience in early Oregon in those intervening years between the two of them. And also, I'm playing with some interesting technology, so if you see me going back and forth with this, let me know if I'm speaking about something that's not on the screen. Great. So, here's, very quickly, I'll just mention that Oregon Black Pioneers is Oregon's only statewide African American historical society. We've been around since 1993. And again, credit to Willie Richardson and the other members of the Oregon Black Pioneers Board who have managed to grow this organization over the past just under 30 years now through volunteer research and partnership building. And it's because of that that I have the opportunity to stand and speak with you all today. We have a number of exhibitions that I'm sure many of you have seen before, probably most notably at Oregon Historical Society. We've had several shows. But we also do many, many talks across the states, virtually and in person, like this one. We have a number of creative projects and special initiatives that we get involved in. If any of you are subscribers to Oregon Black Pioneers and read our newsletter, you might have heard that we just announced a new partnership with Oregon State University on a piece of land near Adair Village called the Letitia Carson Legacy Project, where we are hoping to work with the Black Oregon Land Trust to promote Black entrepreneurial farming, particularly Black women, in the spirit of Letitia Carson, while also talking about early Willamette Valley Black homesteader experiences, heritage skills, animal husbandry. So it's really exciting. We've got a lot of cool ideas about what this really unique piece of property can do to help advance knowledge about Oregon's Black history. So if you want to learn more about that project and many, many other things that we do, I hope you'll visit our website, OregonBlackPioneers.org. So, an abstract for today. In the 1850s, Asahel Bush used his paper, the Oregon Statesman, to promote anti-Black views and build massive public support for the exclusion of Black Americans from Oregon. But within a decade of the passage of Oregon's Constitution and its Black Exclusion Clause, a successful Black community emerged in Salem, which challenged the racist views of Bush and his contemporaries. Among Salem's Black residents was a Civil War veteran named Hiram Gorman, who worked for the very newspaper Bush co-founded from 1871 to 1887. So let's get started. So to tell the story, we have to start with Asahel Bush. Asahel Bush was born in 1824 in Westfield, Massachusetts. That's in western Massachusetts near Springfield. His father was in the printing business, and Asahel took that business over when his father died in 1839. His printing business was meant to support his studies in law, and in 1850, Bush passed the Massachusetts State Bar and became an attorney. 1850 was a really consequential year, not just in Oregon, but also in Asahel Bush's life. It was that year that while still living in Massachusetts, he met Oregon Territory Congressional Delegate Samuel Thurston. Thurston was visiting the East Coast from Oregon, and back in the early provisional and territorial days, Oregon selected one delegate to go to Congress, and so Thurston was that delegate at this time. Today, Thurston County, Washington is named after Samuel Thurston. So he met Bush there in Massachusetts, and he recognized that Asahel Bush had great writing abilities, and he recruited him to come to Oregon and co-found a new newspaper here in the Oregon Territory. For Thurston, the paper represented an opportunity to promote his own political ambitions. He was a Democrat and wanted to have a paper which could propel some of his ideas and hopefully be a platform that could support his candidacy for higher office. So Bush took him up on the offer, and he moved to Oregon, arriving in September 1850. He began working to open the Oregon Statesman newspaper right away, a process that took several months. And that same year, he met and married Eugenia Zeber, who was a daughter of a printer at the paper. They had their first child, Estelle, in 1858. They would ultimately have 4 children together. And in 1851, Thurston died of yellow fever while he was traveling back to Oregon from Washington, D.C. On a steamship. And with that, Bush was now the sole editor of this paper that he co-founded with Thurston. So now let's move into the year 1851. Oregon Statesman began publication in Oregon City, actually, in 1851. The paper followed the changing territorial capitals. It first left Oregon City to go to Salem in 1853, and then to Corvallis for a time in 1855, and then later that year back to Salem. The Statesman, like I mentioned, was the voice of the Oregon Democratic Party, in opposition to the Oregonian in Portland, which was a Whig newspaper published by Thomas Dreyer. Asahel Bush helped to bring together a group of like-minded men in Salem, which came to be known as the Salem Clique by Dreyer and other opponents. Members of this so-called clique included Matthew Deedy, Lafayette Grover, Joseph Lane, DeLazin Smith, George Curry, and others. Now, this is a group of Democrats who worked together to influence the public and the legislature as well in favor of the interests of Democrats. All the men had political ambitions, and they used their alignment to promote each other's candidacy for positions. Lane and Grover were territorial representatives to Congress. Grover and Smith became U.S. senators, and Grover, Lane, and Curry all became governor of Oregon Territory. So clearly, we're talking about men who had a lot of upward mobility potential, and they worked together to promote one another for all of these positions. Bush was critical to all of this maneuvering, as the Oregon Statesman was the mouthpiece for all of these men's political agendas. By publishing their words and actions in the Oregon Statesman, Bush helped amplify their candidacy for office, and perhaps most importantly, solidified their positions as the mainstream. Now, all of this, of course, is going on against the backdrop of tremendous change in the United States. The United States was experiencing intense political divisions over the expansion and limitations of slavery. From 1812 to 1850, Congress tried to pair the admission of every new free state with a new slave state, ensuring an equal balance of pro- and anti-slavery votes in the U.S. Senate. This precarious agreement was meant to prevent Southern secession. Oregon was still a territory, but that did not insulate Oregonians from debates on the national slavery question. In fact, after the Compromise of 1850, when California entered the Union as a free state, pro-slavery senators were compensated by giving territories the right to vote locally on whether or not to allow slavery, a concept known as popular sovereignty. The 1854 Kansas-Nebraska Act affirmed the legality of popular sovereignty, and it nullified the Missouri Compromise, which had banned slavery north of the 3630 parallel. Pro-slavery advocates now look to the territories as the battlegrounds for expanding slavery. Utah and New Mexico territories became slave territories, but they did not apply for statehood immediately afterwards. Meanwhile, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota territories all entered the Union as free states. Oregon Territory became one of the last hopes for slavery supporters to try and win back the votes in favor of their cause in the U.S. Senate. Now, Oregon Democrats distinguished themselves from Southern Democrats in this same time period, notably on the issue of slavery. While some Oregon Democrats were slavery supporters, including members of the Salem clique, like Lane and Deedy, most, like Asahel Bush, were opposed to slavery. However, Oregon's anti-slavery Democrats were not abolitionists. They were not abolitionists. Both pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates went out of their way to emphasize that they saw abolition and citizenship for blacks as against the values of Oregon. Instead, they believed that the presence of blacks, enslaved or free, threatened the economic security of white yeoman farmers. The The so-called free soil ideology of the era does not refer to free from slavery, as it might suggest, but instead the ideology that Western lands should be maintained as the exclusive domain of independent white farmers. By banning slavery, they would help ensure poor whites could succeed without having to compete with wealthy plantation owners. And by banning free blacks, those same poor whites would also not have to compete with black agricultural laborers who would accept the same work, do it just as well, but do it for less pay. The economic prospects and civil liberties of black people were irrelevant to Oregon Democrats. Oregon had few black people anyway, and they preferred it that way. Now, separate from the slavery question, Oregon had already taken steps to prohibit the immigration with an E, of black Americans by the time Bush first arrived. In 1844, the Provisional Government of Oregon passed an act which required emancipation of enslaved persons in Oregon within 3 years for black women or 2 years for black men, but which also required those former slaves to then leave Oregon or be subject to physical beatings of up to 39 lashes every 6 months until they left the Oregon country. Now, this was repealed in 1845. No one that we know of was ever actually beaten under this law. But while people will often mention that it was repealed in 1845, they don't often mention the fact that the lash law was later replaced with a provision that said any formerly enslaved black people who did not leave Oregon would then be sold to the highest bidder and made to do public works. So in the same law which establishes Oregon forever to be a place without slavery, they also created the conditions by which black people could be legally bought and sold. Now in 1849, the second black exclusion law was passed. This one states, quote, "It shall not be lawful for any Negro or mulatto to enter into or reside within the limits of this territory." Very clear. It was in effect until 1854. So, black men and women had no right to voluntarily move west to the Oregon Territory in 1850, as Asahel Bush did that year. Now, this exclusion law did not apply to those black persons already living in Oregon at the time of its adoption. So black men and women who'd come to Oregon between 1845 and 1849, either free or enslaved, had a legal right to remain and reside in the territory. And this is how a handful of black individuals came to represent Oregon's first group of black pioneers. And it also provided cover for those who came to Oregon clandestinely. In 1851, Jacob Vanderpool, a free black sailor who had come to Oregon in 1850, was arrested for having violated the 1849 exclusion law. Vanderpool was a saloon owner in Oregon City, and a competitor was the one who reported him for violating this law. Ultimately, Vanderpool was tried and found guilty and was forced to leave Oregon, making him the only black person that we know of by name who was forcibly removed, citing the black exclusion law. Now, ironically, Vanderpool's business was advertised in the Oregon Statesman, as you see here on the screen, during the paper's very first year of publication, when it was still located in Oregon City. And the Statesman covered the case in one brief entry, that's the one you see on the right, which is one of only 2 known news reports of the Vanderpool case contemporaneous with when it happened. Bush's reporting of the Vanderpool incident is presented very matter-of-factly. He does not offer any sort of opinions on that ruling. However, earlier that year, Bush republished a lengthy editorial from the Richmond Examiner in Virginia, which passionately defends the institution of slavery and the supposed racial inferiority of black people. This is a passage from that on the screen. I think I want to just take a moment to say that I, without exaggeration, would say that this article is probably the most racist piece of published material I've ever seen in my life. This is a very mild example of what that writing is like in this article. So if you'd like to read this is available online. I encourage you to commit that date to memory and look up the whole thing later if you're curious to see exactly what things were lobbied against black people. Now, where am I? The article was printed in the Statesman with a byline stating, quote, "republished by request," end quote. But by whose request? We don't know. While Bush did not write these words, he chose to publish it in his paper on the front page. Historian Barbara Mahoney writes that Thurston had encouraged Bush to write only in, quote, chaste, gentlemanly language, end quote. But with Thurston having died 2 months prior to this, it's clear from the publication of this pro-slavery editorial that Bush was prepared to publish materials which he knew to be controversial. Considering the slavery debates happening nationally, publishing such an essay would be considered unethical today. At best, it represents a kind of trolling, I'm just asking questions journalism of today's podcasters and YouTube personalities. But at its worst, it's an endorsement of everything that that article says. And again, I encourage you to go and read the whole article if you get a chance. So let's jump ahead. 6 years after the paper was in publication. By 1857, Oregonians were preparing to go to the polls to vote on whether to become a state. And on the ballot was the question of whether Oregon should join the Union as a free state or a slave state. Slavery had been banned in Oregon, at least on paper, since the 1843 Organic Laws. But now, 14 years later, the matter was being put to voters for the first time. How did this happen? It demonstrates a successful media strategy by pro-slavery voices to sway an ambivalent public in favor of pro-slavery positions. Clearly, they suspected that there was some chance that if put to the voters, Oregonians would choose to become a slave state. Many newspapers played a role in this, including the Oregon Argus, the Occidental Messenger, the Table Rock Sentinel, and others. However, Democratic papers split on their agendas and if they were best served as a state or as remaining a territory. Following the Roger Taney decision of the Dred Scott versus Sanford case this same year, slavery was now a protected act in territories and could not be prohibited by any national or even local laws. Only states had the right to limit slavery. Therefore, pro-slavery Oregonians and Oregon's existing slave owners would have had their interests best protected by voting no on statehood. Briefly, I also want to point out that although slavery was outlawed in the Oregon Territory on paper long before the Dred Scott decision, we know of over 50 enslaved black men and women who were brought to Oregon. There were even still 6 enslaved black persons counted in Oregon's 1860 census after Oregon became a free state. Asahel Bush tried to present the Oregon Statesman as a platform for both sides of the Democratic Party to present their positions on statehood and on slavery. In the weeks leading up to the Constitutional Convention, Bush published editorials by his colleagues and fellow clique members to allow them an opportunity to appeal to voters directly. Matthew Deedy advocated for slavery on the basis of popular sovereignty. He believed that white men in slave states shouldn't have rights that white men in Oregon didn't have. In this case, that right being the right to own human beings. Deedy wrote, quote, if I am a citizen of Virginia, if a citizen of Virginia can lawfully own a Negro, then I, as a citizen of Oregon, can obtain the same right of property at this Negro, and am entitled to the protection of the government in Oregon as in Virginia, end quote. Anti-slavery men, like Oregon Supreme Court Justice George Williams, who you see here, he made his case by citing an economic and a white supremacist rationale, as the quotes on screen demonstrate. Now, I want to emphasize that both of these are bad takes. These are both terrible takes. Some Oregon Democrats supported slavery because they believed that white men should have equal rights everywhere in the U.S., including the right to own slaves, while other Democrats were against slavery because they believed black people were racially inferior and shouldn't be allowed to commingle with white people. Those are both really bad takes. Clearly, the anti-slavery case is better, but these men were not friends of black people. But they were friends of Asahel Bush. Now, the Constitutional Convention was tasked with creating the draft of the Oregon Constitution, and they met in Salem on August 17, 1857. Of the 60 delegates to the convention, 44 were Democrats, including many members of the Salem clique. The convention had 11 standing committees, and clique members chaired 6 of them. Matthew Deedy was elected president of the convention. Remember, he was our pro-slavery guy. The outsized influence of Democrats, and Salem clique members in particular, meant that it was all but assured that their interests would be reflected in the Constitution. And it was clique member Lafayette Grover who introduced the additional provision on the ballot asking voters to choose whether or not to allow free blacks to come to Oregon. This black exclusion language was included in the preamble to the Oregon Bill of Rights. And I'll just read it for you here. No free Negro or mulatto not residing in this state at the time of its adoption of this Constitution shall come, reside, or be within this state, or hold any real estate, or make any contracts, or maintain any suit therein. The Legislative Assembly shall provide by penal laws for the removal by public officers of all such Negroes and mulattoes, and for their effectual exclusion from the state, and for the punishment of persons who shall bring them into the state, or employ or harbor them. That last one's very interesting. Remember, this is coming on the backdrop of the National Fugitive Slave Act, right? So having penalties for any white people that might be compelled to support black individuals was a penalized offense. The draft Constitution was completed in September, and voters went to the polls on November 9th, 1857. Once all the votes were counted, the Free State cause had won. But 1 out of every 4 voters in 1857 voted in favor of Oregon becoming a slave state. 9 out of 10 voters voted in favor of banning free blacks from coming to Oregon, including 94% of Marion County residents. So the question is, to what extent is Asahel Bush responsible for this? To what extent is he responsible for black exclusion in Oregon? He wasn't its architect, but his papers certainly amplified those who were. Did Bush present the views which were most prevalent in the Willamette Valley at this time? Or was he actively influencing public opinion by publishing what he hoped the voters would achieve? I think it's probably a bit of both. So far, I haven't shared anything that Bush personally wrote which reflects his views on black people. But as you can see here, Bush did author his own writings, which expressed anti-black sentiments prior to the statement vote. Now, on the first one here, writing about an anti-immigrant party known as the Know-Nothings, he chastises members of that party for offering to give votes to Negroes before Irishmen. And in March of 1857, he writes, "The only real question is as to the introduction of slavery into Oregon, is the introduction of slavery into Oregon practicable, and will it prove profitable?" And again, he writes in February of 1857, I'll read this for you, it's a little blurry. "The New York News, the metropolitan organ of Mr. Buchanan," I believe that's future President Buchanan, by the way, I have to verify that, "and the dominant democracy is of the opinion that now here, nowhere under the whole heaven are the Negroes so well off as they are under the bonds of slavery in the slave states of this republic." And then Bush writes, "So we believe. Certainly in no condition in which we find him in the United States is the Negro as well cared for and provided for as under the system of American slavery." Barbara Mahoney, who I've mentioned before, she writes that in 1857, Bush implored his fellow Democrat voters not to listen to abolitionists, who he said were part of a Negro equality movement, and he called those who were their supporters fanatics and expletive-struck dames. He believed that anyone who listened to abolitionists would ultimately only increase support for slavery, sort of like a backlash, right? And then in 1857, I don't have the exact date, but he writes, quote, "We believe that the African is destined to be the servant and subordinate of the superior white race, that the wisdom of man has not yet devised a system under which the Negro is as well off as he is under that of American slavery," repeating sort of that editorial you saw before. "Still, our climate, soil, situation, population, etc., render it an impossible institution in Oregon." So curiously suggesting that Oregon is not a place that black people can physically tolerate the weather. Guys, it's not that serious. It's not that hard. But that just continues the sort of language that we saw Williams writing, right? Talking about sort of this supposed differences in the physical and intellectual capabilities of black people. Well, as we know, Oregon entered the Union as a free state, and the Union's fracturing over the slavery question only became worse, ultimately leading to the Civil War, the bloodiest conflict in American history before or since. Bush's wartime writings expressed his strong anti-Lincoln position. However, he did support the preservation of the Union. At the conclusion of the war, the Union prevailed and chattel slavery in the U.S. was abolished. Another incident during the war years, though, exemplifies Bush's thoughts on both black people in Oregon and on the actions of white people who supported them, illustrating again his thoughts about abolitionists. And it's that incident I want to talk about next. So we're going to move ahead to the year 1862 here. By now, the Civil War is ongoing. Abet Dickinson, who you see in the center there, was born in Massachusetts in 1818, and he came to Oregon with his wife Charlotte in 1853 by steamship. He was a minister of the Congregationalist faith, which is a branch of Calvinists, and he chose Salem as the site for a new church. The Dickinsons were abolitionists, which was a rarity in Oregon. Very few people went out of their way to express support for both the abolishment of slavery and also for the civil rights and protections of black people. Some people say Jesse Applegate was an abolitionist. I'm not as convinced about that. I think he was certainly anti-slavery, but whether or not he would have advocated as strongly for black civil rights as Dickinson, I don't know. In letters written to religious colleagues in the East, Dickinson rails against the evils of slavery and also the unequal treatment of black people in Oregon. Dickinson's first church was this small cabin near Liberty and Center Streets. I don't know the original source of this image, but I know this is a cropped image, which is just a part of it. It's from a book that we have in our collection. The Congregational church was very small. His membership was usually less than 30 persons. But Dickinson was committed to equality under God, and he controversially offered services to white and black Salemites together, stating that nothing in his religion indicated to him that segregation and unequal treatment was acceptable. By the 1860s, his sermons were becoming increasingly activist. He offered severe criticism of acts of violence and discrimination against black Salemites, and for the lack of education services available to black students in particular. Putting his words into action, the Dickinsons began offering school lessons to black students in 1863 in this same cabin that you see here. So you can consider this the first school for black children in Oregon's history. Even as the Civil War had already begun, Dickinson was denigrated for being an abolitionist. Leading that criticism was Asahel Bush. Despite both men being from Massachusetts, and the fact that Bush rejected slavery, Bush nonetheless saw Dickinson's abolitionism as an example of northern interference in actions which might cause racial intermixing. Clearly, they did cause racial intermixing. I guess Dickinson and Bush had different opinions about whether or not that was a good or bad thing. This all came to a head in 1863 with the marriage of America Waldo and Richard Bogle. America was born into slavery in Missouri in 1844. She and her mother were owned by the Waldo family. Daniel Waldo had come to Oregon in 1843, and his brothers came the next year. After the death of their father, John, in 1854, John Waldo's widow, Averia, came to join the rest of the Waldo family in Oregon, bringing America along with her. The Waldos lived in a large farmhouse in the area east of Salem, known as Waldo Hills. Although her legal status is uncertain, America appears to have lived as a free member of the Waldo family. On January 1st, 1863, America married Richard Bogle, a free black immigrant from Jamaica, who worked as a barber here in Salem. The date of the wedding was specifically chosen. It was the date that Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. Abet Dickinson was the officiant of this wedding, and many of the attendees were prominent members of Salem's white community, including Salem Clique member Reuben Boys, as a matter of fact. This mixed-race wedding with a white minister and a black couple was unheard of in Oregon and made headlines across the West Coast. Unfortunately, the coverage was exclusively negative. Here's how Asahel Bush reported the wedding in the Oregon Statesman, and that's an image of Dickinson. For some years, Reverend O. Dickinson of the First Congregational Church, Salem, has been disseminating among his congregation Negro equality sentiment. There's that language again. He's used that several times here. At which he is wholly and conscientiously imbued. All or nearly all the Negroes hereabouts had at one time or another been gathered into the membership or society and were usually present at his ministrations. The matter culminated in what is commonly known as the expletive wedding. The gossip excited by that affair was followed by the revolt of the non-sympathizing portion of the society, who adopted a series of resolutions setting forth their opinion that slavery was a great moral evil, but that while it was so, the continuation of Mr. O's anti-slavery and Negro sympathy preaching was calculated only to prevent the growth of the church and retard the spread of religion, and Mr. O was requested to discontinue them. His conclusion was that it was his duty to continue in the work that he had begun, and that if he preached the gospel, he must rebuke the sin and injustice which the community inflicted upon the Negro. The result is expected to be Mr. Dickinson's resignation of or removal from the pastorship of this church. Now, the public fallout from the Waldo Bogle wedding was severe. White attendees were publicly shamed in the Statesman even weeks after. And as the reporting here suggests, white members of Dickinson's church did force him to resign. He did so in March of 1863, although he did return to the parish by September. In 1867, he resigned for good, and he opened a seed store here in Salem. Now here is how Bush describes the wedding in private, writing to Matthew Deedy. I asked the man who had been at Reverend Oberlin Dickinson's New Year's party. The Reverend is a free expletive man, and how many expletives were present. He said 1, Joe Wilson, and 3 or 4 others. That apparently is a joke. Joe Wilson was a white man, so that was an insult that they were writing to one another. Last week, a couple of expletives were married here at the house of an expletive. Wilson and his family were present, Dickinson and his missus, Boys and Lizzie, Terry's wife, Reed's wife, Pratt's wife and daughter, Joe Watt's sister, and 1 or 2 other women attended. They had a feast, and Joe presided at the table. At it were the whites named and 6 expletives, 3 bucks and 3 wenches. Am I not a man and a brother? That's another insult there. They're mocking the abolitionist slogan. It was Negro equality sentiment mixed up with a little snob aristocracy. The first circle character of the whites was expected to give eclat to the affair and bar all remarks, but it has caused a good deal of gossip and is generally regarded as shameful by the community. Very interesting to see how he writes differently of this matter when writing to his friend and how he puts in his paper, right? Neither one was good, but perhaps he was still clinging to a little bit of Thurston's gentlemanly language that he had implored him to write in. Also in that year, 1863, is when Asahel Bush sold his paper after the death of his wife, Eugenia. He continued to live on the 100-acre property that they had shared since 1860, and in 1878, he and his family would move into a large new home on the site. Those today are the Bush Pasture Park and the Bush House Museum, respectively. Bush remained active in his post-publishing years. In 1867, he co-founded Ladd and Bush Bank. I walked past it this afternoon, First Bank in Salem. And he was the Oregon delegate to the Democratic National Convention in 1892. He also occasionally wrote editorials for the Oregon Statesman. After the Civil War ended, he wrote of his desire for reconciliation with slave owners, who were, after all, his fellow Democrats. In a letter dated November 5th, 1866, he does not waver in his anti-black views, writing, quote, "Surely there is a love of country which shall not combine with too great a veneration of the Negro." End quote. And that is all I have to say about Bush. But now we're going to jump ahead in time again, and this time I want to talk about some of the people who were living here alongside of Bush this whole time, and that is members of Salem's black community. All the while, as Bush was getting established in Salem, a black community was forming in the city. In fact, they were already here. Before Bush even arrived in Oregon, Marion County already had 9 black or mulatto residents counted in the 1850 census. That's very early. And this is in spite of those black exclusion laws that I talked about earlier. By 1860, it was up to 17, 6 adults and 11 youth. By 1870, it was 61, 33 adults and 28 youth. So clearly we're talking about families here. The black population in Marion County from 1860 to 1870 alone had grown 258%. What this demonstrates is how in the aftermath of the Civil War, black Americans had new opportunities to come to Oregon and make a life for themselves and their families. There was the passage of the Reconstruction Amendments, which made black exclusion in Oregon unenforceable. That, of course, was the most important one. But there was also mining booms that brought hundreds of new black immigrants to Oregon, specifically to Jackson, Grant, and Wasco counties, and then members of those gold rush communities, several of them found their way to Oregon, or to Salem. Also, the Homestead Act of 1866 presented a realistic opportunity for black Americans to earn a land grant title as the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850 had been off limits to free blacks. There were not very many black individuals who did file a successful Homestead Act claim in Oregon, just a handful. But nonetheless, this is a clear shift in national policy. In 1867, black citizens created their own school on the same block as Salem Central School. They called it Little Central. It had 15 pupils and lasted 1 year, though an evening school was reported to be run by Salem's black residents beginning in 1868, as that little article shows you there. Prominent black figures like George Putnam Riley, who had been part of the Exodus community that went to British Columbia and then come back to the Pacific Northwest. He came to speak to black residents of Salem to talk about how to best use their new 15th Amendment right to vote. And the community gathered every January 1st to celebrate their Emancipation Day. Now in 1871, Salem's black community gained one new member that I want to talk about, and that is Hiram Hi Gorman. Hi's story actually begins with his mother. In 1844, way before the events that we've talked about so far, a white planter named John Thorpe and his family set off from their Kentucky plantation to Independence, Missouri, and then en route to the Willamette Valley. The Thorpes brought along 2 enslaved people, 33-year-old Hannah and her 5-year-old daughter, Eliza. 9-year-old Hiram, her son, was forced to remain behind in Missouri. Now the Thorpes ultimately settled in Polk County. Little is known about Hannah and Eliza's first years in Oregon, but they were legally entitled to freedom after 3 years of being residents of Oregon. They are not listed as slaves in the 1850 census. At some point in the early 1850s, the 2 took the last name Gorman. We don't know where that comes from, but they moved south to Benton County, becoming that county's first black settlers. To make a living, Hannah worked as a laundress and Eliza as a seamstress. Excuse me. They were successful in their business and were able to purchase their first home in 1857, a modest 2-level brick house in downtown Corvallis, which still stands today. That's what you see in that picture there. It's on 4th Street. You can drive by and pay a visit if you'd like. Eliza died in 1869 of an unknown illness at just 30 years old. She was memorialized in a fawning obituary in the Corvallis Gazette, demonstrating her impact on the community and her church membership. After Eliza's death, Hannah moved several more times, although she retained ownership of her Corvallis home. In 1870, she was in Portland, living in the home of a Methodist minister and his wife. Now, all that, where are we? Oh, after being left behind as a 9-year-old, there was no indication that Hiram would ever see his mother or his sister again. Family separations, of course, were very common at this time. Nothing is known of Hiram's early life until 1861, when Missouri seceded to join the Confederate States of America. By late summer, though, Union forces under John C. Fremont had retaken Missouri and emancipated enslaved blacks as they went along. Hiram was one of the thousands of black people now liberated, and he volunteered to support the federal cause. Gorman served as a teamster, or a wagon driver, for Union troops and was present at the famous Battle of Wilson Creek in August of 1861. Now, to be clear, he was a civilian teamster. He was not a Buffalo soldier. I've seen people say that before, but that refers to some very specific regiments that he was not a part of. When the war ended in 1865, Hiram went west. He was named as a resident of Montana in 1865 and was living with a wife named Georgia Ann from Kentucky, and they had an infant son named Frank. After leaving Montana, Hiram and his family came to Oregon. Hiram arrived in Salem in 1871 and was able to reunite with his mother for the first time in almost 40 years. In 1875, Hannah sold her Corvallis home to Hiram and moved in with him and Georgia Ann in their Salem home. Hannah would later move back to Corvallis, where she lived as a boarder until her death in 1888. Now, that home that they lived in Salem, it's unclear which one it was. In various newspaper reports, it was said that Hiram and his family lived on Front Street. It was said they lived at the corner of Liberty and Chemeketa, at the site of Salem Center downtown today. And in this report that you see on here from 1897, long afterwards, a home burned down that they referred to as the former Hi Gorman house. And that one was, quote, on the east side of High Drive, a short distance north of Division. So I've got a little Google Maps there. So maybe they lived in a little vacant lot that's at that spot that you see. Maybe that's familiar to some of you all, but I don't know where that is. Regardless, clearly they lived in multiple homes during their time. Hiram quickly became known around town for his green thumb. Community stories published in local papers reflected the pride that Gorman took in his vegetable garden. something that I think is great. I love that. From here, Hiram Gorman, a colored individual who lives at the corner of Liberty and Chemeketa Streets, brought to this office yesterday a pea stalk grown on his plantation, which measures 7 feet and 3 inches in length. And then later, hemp. Hi Gorman, Hi Gorman brought to our office yesterday 4 or 5 stalks of hemp, which were grown on his lot near Front Street in this city. The soil in his yard is badly mixed with gravel, yet the specimens shown us have grown to the height of over 4 feet. The stalks are excellent and of fine, healthy growth. I love that. I did mention I was a park ranger, right? So I like the plants. The plants are good. Make me happy. And then one more. Mr. Hi Gorman has one of the finest gardens we have noticed in the city. Yesterday evening he brought us in a nice bunch of beans, which for size at this season of the year are hard to surpass. Great. So Hiram's first job in Salem was operating a shoe shine stand on Front Street in 1871. That must not have lasted long because it was in that year, and remember this is his first year in town. Within the first few months of arriving in Oregon, he's already got a couple of jobs. But in that same year is when he started working for the Oregon Statesman. Hiram was hired to work the hand-powered letterpress that printed every copy of the Oregon Statesman. The device was iron and it required a strong person to adjust its parts and constantly turn the crank. I've seen these on YouTube and I encourage you to look them up how they work. There's a big crank in the back and the paper loads onto a sort of angled sheet that then slides down a long track. And there's a roller underneath that goes into the ink. So as you turn the crank, it runs underneath, and when it pulls back, it grabs it and drops a little part underneath so that it doesn't stamp on the ink on the way back up. And all the while that this is happening, you also have to be very dexterous because you have to grab the next page and set it. So as he's doing this, I can just imagine the finesse and repetition of this labor. So, you obviously had to have quick hands. Now, we don't know much about Hiram Gorman's appearance, but he was described in multiple sources as large or a giant, even in one source. His feats of strength are also well documented by the Oregon Statesman. So I can imagine why he might have been chosen for this job. I can imagine this iron crank might have been something that required a lot of strength. The hand-powered press was in use from 1871 until 1872, until it was replaced permanently by a steam-powered press in December of 1883. And as this article describes, that ended Hiram Gorman's 12 successive years of work operating this press. Now, before I started preparing this talk, I thought that that was naturally when his work at the Statesman was over. But it turns out that Hiram continued to work for the Oregon Statesman even after it was no longer using this same hand-powered press. It appears that after this, he started doing odd jobs for the paper, janitorial work, and tasks which required moving heavy items. And it was during this time that he takes on various monikers, at least mock titles in the Statesman. He was referred to as their fighting editor, or as Dr. Gorman, Hiram Gorman Esquire, or Professor Gorman. Here's one example. Hiram Gorman, fighting editor of the Statesman, gives due notice that those who post posters on the windows that he's going to fight them, essentially. There's a little joke here. It says he'll fight them bare-knuckle style, Marcus of Gooseberry rules. If any of you know boxing, boxing uses the Marcus of Queensberry rules, so this is a little joke. Here's another one. Professor Gorman Esquire returned to Portland last evening. He had been paying a visit to colored friends, having been taken as a witness in a case before the circuit court. He's lived in Salem ever since the woods were burnt, and this was his first trip he ever made to Portland, and he did his best to keep from going this time. And here's a couple others. On the left, it's hard to read, but this is a list of fake presents that the staff of the Oregon Statesman gave to each other for Christmas. And it says that fighting editor of this paper, Professor Hiram Gorman, will hold himself in readiness to make all changes that may be necessary. He also is personally accountable for the presents given. And those presents include things like a large house, a widow, a box of love powders, a nest egg, a young cornet soloist, etc. So little funny jokes here. And then the other one, talking about a large barrel that weighed over 400 pounds, full of ink, that they had to bring up the stairs and they didn't know how they would do it. But that Hiram Gorman, the fighting editor, yesterday took up the barrel playfully in his left hand and and carried it up the stairs. And you, dear reader, may now be reading the characters made with the assistance of the contents of this same barrel. I actually want you to consider that. Keep that little point in your mind. And the last one here. Everyone knows Professor Hiram Gorman, fighting editor of Statesman. If you are not acquainted, you should get an introduction at once. He's called a fighting editor because he drinks so much whiskey and he has never been known to fight. Well, Hi has been on the sick list the past week. He drank a glass of ice water on the 4th of July, and it's such a surprise to his stomach that it gave his internal economy a terrible shock. And he turned pale with pain. Hi says he won't be able to drink any more ice water, not even on a national holiday. That's just funny. I don't care either. That's funny. Now, these monikers appear to be playful. They're meant as terms of endearment. I think anyone who would read that could tell. But it's clear from the punchline that these jokes are often pointing at Gorman's lack of a formal education. We know that he couldn't read, and that comes up in a couple of these articles. And also his pugnacious personality. Articles like this suggest that he drank heavily, but honestly that would not have been uncommon for men of this era. And the effect appears to also play into racial stereotypes of black men being lazy or drunks. We definitely would not stand for someone to be presented this way today. We could find better ways to playfully talk about our colleagues than to refer to them this way. Now, I still think it's safe to say that while Hiram's white colleagues were playing into racial stereotypes, I can also see that they cared about him and they considered him a part of their community. His personal and family business were reported on too, as seen in the writings on his garden and his comings and goings, and on the marriages of his children. There were no jokes about him reported when his health started to fail or in his obituary. Hiram died in 1888 after a long illness. His mother, Hannah, actually died that same year. Asahel Bush lived a long, happy life. He died in 1913 at the age of 89. And so, what does all this mean? Well, the purpose of this presentation, again, was to point out the contradictions of Bush and the Statesman in shaping black exclusion, while also depending on a prominent member of Salem's black community. Remember that note about you, dear readers, maybe reading a newspaper printed from the ink of this same barrel, right? That is really sort of what inspired this whole talk, thinking about that contradiction. The fact that this paper depended on the labor of a black person, when the founder of the paper itself would have preferred that black people were never here at all. In a relatively short amount of time, life for Black Oregonians changed so much. And we can see that change play out in the years which link Asahel Bush to Hiram Gorman. When Asahel Bush began the Oregon Statesman in 1851, Black Oregonians were being legislated out of existence and literally forced out of the territory. But 20 years later, black men and women in Salem owned their own homes and businesses. They were active members of the church, and they made lasting impressions on their white neighbors who represented their colleagues, their customers, and their friends. All of this we can see through the example of Hiram Gorman. Bush and his contemporaries viewed the presence of black people in Oregon as doomsday for law and order and for white economic opportunities. Yet, as is always the case, it was black people who were the victims of an unequal justice system, and it was black people whose economic prospects were the most vulnerable to the maneuverings of white business interests. Asahel Bush authored and elevated many racist viewpoints. His life's work, the Oregon Statesman, also played a part in swaying white voters to prohibit black people from participating in their society, and he platformed the opinions of pro-slavery advocates. But to me, that makes the irony so much sweeter that for 12 years, after he'd sold the company, every issue of the Oregon Statesman passed through black hands, through Hiram Gorman's hands. Every single issue. And that has to include every single issue that was delivered to the Bush house on his doorstep that Asahel Bush would have read each day, or each week, I suppose. Hiram Gorman was a freedman, he was a veteran, he was a husband, a father, a gardener, and a worker. But he was also just one man within a whole community of black pioneers whose experiences share so many similarities with his own. In his example, we can see the dignity and potential of every person, and we can consider all of those like him who didn't get the chance to succeed because of a violent white supremacy which men like Asahel Bush represented. While Bush and other members of the Salem clique may have envisioned a white utopia in the absence of black people, black Salemites defied that prejudice to form one of the earliest, largest, and most successful black communities in the Pacific Northwest within their lifetimes. Today, the bones of Hiram Gorman and more than 40 other black Salemites rest not far from the proponents of this white supremacy, as an eternal irony in the story of 19th century Oregon. And so that is my talk. I want to thank you all again for giving me the opportunity. I have time for questions. I love questions. I'll do my best to answer any questions you may have. So please feel free to raise your hand or call and we will chat. Yes, sir.
Did Bush ever own slaves?
No, sir.
Never a slave owner?
I'm begging
He
pardon?
was never a slave owner.
He was never a slave owner. No. Again, Bush was anti-slavery, but his rationale of why he was anti-slavery is still a racist viewpoint. He didn't believe in slavery because he didn't believe black people should exist in Oregon at all. And I'd have to think that if given the choice whether or not to allow free blacks into Oregon or to allow enslaved blacks, he might have chose the latter, because he used the Oregon Statesman as a platform to present all the viewpoints of pro-slavery advocates. And he published that editorial like the one I showed you from 1851. Yes?
I believe the headstone a moment ago is Pioneer Cemetery off the commercial.
Yes.
What is the history of the headstone? It looks new.
Oh, I'm not the person to ask. That's a good question, though. I'm sure that it's probably been well maintained, unlike the headstones, if there are any, for the black individuals who are buried in that same cemetery. Most of the black individuals from the 19th century buried in that cemetery are buried in unmarked graves, and it was because of Oregon black pioneers and people like Willie Richardson that they have a memorial at all today, which was put up in 2007, to honor those who did not have headstones of their own. Yes?
Where did you find all the research? I mean, your research looks fascinating. Where did you find all this information?
Sure. So I have to credit Barbara Mahoney, who's written about this for, I think, OHQ, Oregon Historical Quarterly. I found that on JSTOR. All the newspaper clippings you found, I was able to find with newspapers.com, which is not that expensive. If you like to do this work and you want to do it, I encourage you to get a subscription. It's fascinating the things that you'll find. And the rest are things that I found from other published materials. Again, I did very little original scholarship this talk. My job is to take things that are spread very far apart and bring them together to form a cohesive story for us to learn from together.
Great, thank you very much.
Anyone else? Yes?
Will you be doing more presentations? I feel like we're such a small group here, and I would love for you to be at the Elsinore Phil and do some sort of a TED Talk.
Oh, a TED Talk, how fun. Well, Oregon Black Pioneers does many presentations. I was telling Matthew earlier, I think this is about my 30th presentation of the year. Almost all of those have been virtual. And so that's still probably the easiest way to have us be available. But at the same time, we are hoping that with some good fundraising, we'll be able to hire this year a public programs and education person who can take the lead on being our outreach officer and can do more of these in-person presentations on our behalf. Right now, I'm a staff of one, and we just hired a new communications manager, so it's been difficult for me to make myself available for all of the requests. But if you have a specific event that you would hope that we could speak at, or a specific topic you want to know more about, on our website is a request form. So if you could just go to public programs on our website and then make a request, we will get back to you and we'll look over dates together. Yeah. Thank you. Anyone else?
You mentioned the First Congregationalist Church.
Yes.
And where did you get the material on that? And have you ever thought about giving a presentation there, possibly?
That would be really interesting and really worthwhile. So there was a book, I don't know when it was published, but it's a book called Abet Dickinson's War Against Sin in Salem. And that was a great resource, talking about what some of the source material was. That was a great resource, and it is where I found the Dee letter that Bush wrote. Yeah, so that was a good one. It might be hard to find that book, to be honest with you, so I'm glad that we have a copy.
Yeah.
I saw somebody just flashed a copy of our book in the back. Oregon Black Pioneers has a couple books. That's one of ours. That's Perseverance. It's a history of blacks that married in Polk counties. And we also have one of the Images of America series books African Americans in Portland. And by fall, we will be able to make available again the landmark 1980 book, Peculiar Paradise, The History of Blacks in Oregon, 1788 to 1940. It's been out of print since the 1980s, but we were able to secure the copyright, and we're working with Oregon State University Press to make it available again. So, stocking stuffers, if you want to learn about Oregon Black history, just keep an eye on us, and we'll have some great resources. Yes?
There are a few of us here from the Congregational Church, and you have a standing invitation to come anytime. And there is a Atlantic University professor who's written a fair amount about Obed, and I'm blanking out on her name, but she's done some great scholarship for that era, for him and his family.
I've learned a bit also from Kylie Pine, the curator at the William and
Yeah.
Center here in town. So they have a good amount of resources to talk about Dickinson. One of probably the most remarkable objects in our collections is actually a coverlet that was owned by Abet Dickinson that came with them from Massachusetts to Oregon. So that's a treasure that we get to preserve today.
What is it?
It's a coverlet, so it's a woven tapestry.
Where is it?
It's in our collection storage unit. Actually, it's at the Land of Heritage. That one requires some additional conservation, so they are the keepers of it right now. Yes?
Maybe I missed it in your presentation, but did Ashael Bush claim to be a Christian? Were any of these, I heard a lot about the economics of it.
Sure.
I get that.
Right.
And just the racism of it, but I didn't hear about his religious, anything you found on that, his religious background?
That's interesting. You know, I don't know the answer. I don't recall seeing specific references to it. I think for a man of his stature, for him to not have had a presence in a local church would have probably been strange, but I don't have any more information. Do you?
Yeah, he was Unitarian.
He was a Unitarian.
Oh, yes.
That is not a knock on the Unitarian. You're going to get us in trouble. Yes.
So, to what extent do we know about black folks in Oregon and what we refer to as indigenous folks now, like black folks in South Tuya or Paiute? Yeah, do we know much about that?
Yes, they work together often, much to the what is the right word? It worried white people a lot.
Yeah.
So there's a famous case. There was a man named James Sauls. James Sauls was an early black resident who came to Astoria first, and he worked as a bar pilot. But then he bought land from another early black individual named Winslow Anderson, who was living in Clackamas County. And so Sauls moves to Clackamas, buys some land there, and he was accused of trying to plot some sort of an insurrection or burn down the home of his white neighbor. And they alleged that he was conspiring with the Clackamas to do that. Whether or not it's true, we don't know. But this was before the Black Exclusion Law was authored. And so they didn't have a legal way to make him leave Oregon. But nonetheless, the militia forced him to leave the Willamette Valley. And he went back to Clatsop County and lived in that area the rest of his life. And there's plenty of examples that we can point to from the 19th century of black and indigenous peoples becoming married. Blacks and whites, of course, would not have been allowed to marry at this time. And so for the largely black male population coming here, the only opportunity for them to marry and have families would have been from indigenous women. And that happened many times. So, you know, I want to make it clear, early black individuals participated in the systemic displacement of indigenous peoples.
Right.
This is a settler colonialism story as well for black individuals, just as it was for white individuals. However, there's a shared history of being targets and resisting white supremacy between black and indigenous Oregonians.
Yeah.
Of course. Yes?
I sort of represent the A.C. Gilbert's Children's Museum in a way. And one of the books that A.C. wrote was called The Man Who Lives in Paradise. And he actually, this is something he wrote at the end of his life. And he actually made a point of the discipline his father gave him. And he got one spanking in his life that we know about. And there was a Chinese washing facility that did close in town. And he says in his book, he even has a picture of it, where there was a young boy there, and he had pigtails, and he poked one of the pigtails. And his dad heard about that, and he got a good spanking when he got home. And he mentioned that at the end of his life. And they were the founders of the First Congregationalist Church. So that tells me they had a strong issue with, everybody's God's image and what are we doing dumb things, and his father certainly didn't tolerate it. So.
Yeah, that reminds me, I presented on a lot of things here that are very heavy, examples of overt racism, but if someone would want to resist the urge to share this history and suggest, well, everyone in the past was racist, so why devote this time and attention towards specific examples of it? And the truth is that everyone in the past was not racist. There are many examples we can point to of white people who refused to be caught up in this racist rhetoric and participate any more to the extent that they could in marginalization of black and other people of color that came to Oregon, the Chinese, indigenous peoples. And so one great example of this is the fact that during the Exclusion era in Portland, there were two brothers, Abner and Isaac Francis. They were from New York State, and they came and opened a clothing shop in Portland. And they were both black. They were targeted for exclusion under the same law that caused Vanderpool to be kicked out. But 250 white members of Portland's community signed a petition to refuse that act to be carried out. And so the Francis brothers were able to remain. And so coordinated action by white people has resulted in support for black people and the opportunity to succeed here. And it just goes to show you that if there's an interest in doing that, it could happen. And so examples like Vanderpool, to me, demonstrates that in Oregon City, the climate for racial tolerance was far less than perhaps in urban Portland. Now, of course, individual people play a part. Maybe maybe Jacob Vanderpool had rubbed some people the wrong way. We don't know. But the point is, people did take a stand when they said, this is not right. And so I don't want you to walk out of here and think, well, Asahel Bush did all those things, he said all these words, but he was just a man of his time. Again, whether or not he was promoting a viewpoint or if he was just amplifying a viewpoint is unclear, but there were people here in Salem who did not agree with that, and they took steps to keep it from happening. Yeah. Yes?
So, was there at all a personal relationship between Bush and Gorman? Or, how some people can have a personal great relationship with someone, but when you consider the whole, it's negative?
I haven't seen any indications that they knew each other at all.
Okay.
Yeah. And so Bush had sold the paper, and I think there was a period of 7 years between when he sold the paper and when Hiram was hired.
Yeah.
So there was a little bit of a gap between that. Of course, those gap years included the finishing years of the Civil War. So there was no opportunity for Hiram to really come here at that time. But it's afterwards that he arrives and becomes one of just many people who are part of the Salem black community. He wasn't the only person here. So his story is just one of many that we can point to, successful black individuals who were members of a community and started businesses and were participating in church and had hobbies and interests and had military service, all of those things.
So I mentioned Gorman, but I guess I meant a personal relationship with any individual.
Any black individual?
Yeah, any black.
I don't know.
Thank you.
Yes,
I guess I
ma'am?
was struck today, before I came, I read the front page article in the Statesman Journal about this, and what really struck me was, when you talk about Bush and Dickinson, Bush has a number of buildings, named for him. Dickinson has none.
Yeah.
So that shows us where our values are in some ways.
It does. It does. And also the way that we remember the past, right? That's what history is. History isn't telling the things that happened in the past. It's telling how we remember the past.
Yeah.
And so people have chosen to remember the individuals who are associated with monumental structures or who founded landmark institutions that still exist to this day. Your church still exists to this day, right? So that is a landmark institution. So where is the representation of Dickinson? It comes down to our value systems and what has been historically the values that represent the community today. I think today, Dickinson is probably someone whose values are closer aligned to ours than Asahel Bush's. But that doesn't diminish all the things that Bush contributed to this community. I think that we need to elevate every voice and give ourselves the opportunity to look at the whole scope of people's history and talk very candidly about the good and the bad. I think that, I'll take yours, and then I think I'm going to close. Yes.
Okay. Do you have any idea what the black population was at its biggest in the 1800s here in Salem?
At any one time, so let's see, I mentioned the quote there, in 1870 census, it was 64, and I think that the largest period of population growth for Black Oregonians from one census year to another was from 1880 to 1890. I think that it had reached something like 160, but please don't quote me on that. That information you can look up, but I think that would have been the peak year, to be honest, like around 1890, 1900, or at least the largest number relative to the percentage of people overall.
I grew up here and there was one black family in the 50s, so they all...
Yeah, I can't say specifically about what conditions could have created that in the 1950s. Certainly discriminatory housing must have played a part, as well as where are the economic opportunities for Black people, right? There was great discrimination in industrial workforces in Oregon, particularly in the years during and after the World War II. And so if someone wanted to find a job in one of Oregon's traditional industries, those opportunities would have been few and far between. So the ability to create homegrown, multi-generational families of Black individuals probably grew slimmer and slimmer over time, and it probably moved in conjunction with the growth of the Black population in Portland. So it could be that people moved from the valley to the city to find new opportunities. Well, thank you all again. This has been really fun.
Just a couple of announcements. First, he just took it down, but consider visiting the website and reading more, but also making a donation to Oregon Black Pioneers. Zachary's work, like all of our works in nonprofit, relies heavily on individual contributions, so it's a way to continue that work. I want to announce a couple of related shows and exhibitions, and I'm going to save the best for the end, so stick with me. Not that the others aren't good, but this week we have a talk downstairs by some gallery owners, really 4 artists who are early in their career thinking about how to, work sort of the business side of art. So if you know artists, they can check out our website. That's an ongoing series that we're kicking off this week. The following week, Wednesday, I believe is the 25th, a lunchtime virtual series at noon by the artist who created these 4 paintings. Portland-based Jeremy Akai Davis, extraordinary painter. Most of these images come from magazines in the 50s and 60s and 70s. They are actors and performers, and he's recreating them with a contemporary lens. He's just a beautiful painter, and it's really worth taking a look at this lecture. That's Wednesday, I think the 25th. We are reopening the Bush House Museum on July 7th, after the pandemic. We've been closed for 2.5 years, with a new exhibition. And it's an exhibition of immigrants to Oregon, contemporary immigrants. There's a series of young dreamers from Central and South American country. There's a series of women who have survived genocide in 3 African countries. There are others, but their stories and their images are throughout the Bush House Museum. And it is a way of reopening by saying all are welcome. We're kicking off this reimagining process by telling lots of folk stories, folks whose stories, like Hiram's, haven't been told before. So think about, let's see, July 7th, it'll run all the way through September. 2 more announcements. One is that Art Fair will be live and free for all SAA members this year. So if you're a member, remembered to not buy a ticket, we'll send you a discount code for a free one. And then last, but definitely not least, opening next January here in this space. We have all, Zachary and I have talked a couple times about Willie Richardson, the founder of Oregon Black Pioneers, who is sitting right there, and notably has on not only the only hat in the area, in the room, but an extraordinary hat. Willie used to own a hat store. Willie, here in Salem. Willie has a collection, is it okay if I say?
It's fairly substantial.
Okay. Very substantial is north of 200 hats. Beautiful hats that are both objects of art or beauty, but also in Willie's telling have a social construction. The way that she is received in a store in Salem, for example, when she walks in formally dressed with a hat compared to when she doesn't. And so that there is a social sort of history and construction to these beautiful objects. That'll be here in January and February in this space. We are thrilled for it. Hopefully we'll be able to get Willie to talk about it as well. So we have a whole bunch more, exhibitions. Kathleen Fish is here, so please don't forget to go to World Beat at the end of June, June 25th, 26th, first time in a couple of years we're having World Beat live. So thanks for turning out, thanks for supporting local programming, and enjoy your afternoon.